Have you ever truly stopped to consider how you think? I mean, not just the content of your thoughts, your memories, your understanding of language, your insights, but the underlying intricate machinery that actually allows these cognitive processes to happen. It's a question that has captivated philosophers for centuries and scientists for decades.
Yeah.
For a long, long time, the dominant view of how intelligence, both human and artificial, fundamentally worked was, well, incredibly rigid, almost like a meticulously crafted clockwork mechanism.
That's right. Yeah, throughout much of the 20th century, the prevailing paradigm in fields like artificial intelligence and cognitive science was deeply rooted in formal logic. It conceived of intelligence as an elaborate system of symbols and rules. The core belief was, beautifully simple in a way. If you could just encode enough precise rules, then complex reasoning would naturally follow. This approach, while elegant and intuitively appealing on the surface, eventually encountered some truly significant and difficult to surmount obstacles.
Right. And today we're taking a deep dive into a revolutionary intellectual shift, a paradigm-changing moment that redefined how many scientists understood cognition. It was sparked by two visionary researchers, David Rumelhart and James McClelland, and their really important parallel distributed processing, or PDP, volumes. They didn't just offer an alternative, they completely reimagined the very fabric of thought.
Exactly. Our mission today is to explore precisely how PDP models dramatically shifted the understanding of thought. Instead of the symbolic, rule-based approach, they proposed a more fluid, dynamic, and arguably more biologically plausible concept. That intelligence arises from constantly changing patterns of activation spread across vast networks of interconnected units. We'll journey through fascinating case studies that showcase PDP's, unexpected power in areas like language comprehension, memory recall, and the very mechanics of learning. Ultimately, we'll see how this connectionist approach profoundly challenged and in many ways transformed the symbolic paradigm forever, leaving an indelible mark not only on AI, but also on psychology, neuroscience, and even the philosophy of mind.
So if you're ready to unravel some of the deepest mysteries of how both artificial and human minds might function, let's unpack this. Okay, so before Rumelhart and McClelland really brought their revolutionary ideas to the forefront, the world of AI and cognitive science looked remarkably different. For decades, the dominant metaphor for the mind wasn't a sprawling adaptive network, but rather a highly disciplined, rule-following machine.
Indeed. This approach, often called symbolic AI, traced its intellectual lineage back to the formal logic programs of giants like Frege, Whitehead, and Russell. It essentially viewed intelligence as a sophisticated symbol game. The core idea was that fundamental mathematical and logical concepts, and by extension, potentially all of human knowledge, could be represented by discrete, abstract tokens or symbols. The magic happened when these meaningless tokens, as they put it, were manipulated according to purely syntactic rules, much like shuffling cards in a very specific, predefined way. The grand aspiration was to build a mechanical system capable of proving theorems, solving intricate problems, and even simulating human-like reasoning purely by applying these rules to symbols, regardless of whether the machine itself understood their inherent meaning.
Correct. It was all about the rules.
It was all about the precision of the rules governing the symbols.
And to really grasp this, think about some of the early triumphs of AI. Programs like the Logic Theorist, developed by Alan Newell, Herbert Simon, and Cliff Shaw back in the 1950s. They could autonomously prove mathematical theorems. Or General Problem Solver, which aimed to solve any problem that could be expressed as a set of rules. We also saw early chess programs that could beat formidable human players. These systems weren't understanding the nuances of chess strategy or the elegance of a mathematical proof in a human sense. They were rigorously applying predefined, explicit rules to symbolic representations of the board state or the logical propositions.
Exactly. For many years, this was considered the pinnacle of computational intelligence, a powerful testament to the elegance of logical deduction. And this symbolic ascendancy continued, giving rise to expert systems in the 1970s and 80s. These systems attempted to capture human expertise by programming them with vast collections of if-then rules, aiming to develop common-sense systems. A well-known early example was ELIZA, developed by Joseph Weizenbaum. Though relatively simple, it mimicked a psychotherapist and, in its rudimentary way, arrestingly demonstrated what symbolic systems could appear to do.
Right.
It parsed user input for keywords and deployed canned responses, yet users often projected far more understanding onto it than it truly possessed. This inadvertently bolstered the symbolic approach's appeal, giving the impression that genuine conversation might be just a few more rules away.
So ELIZA was almost a kind of parlor trick, you could say, but a very convincing one at the time. Yet these expert systems and symbolic approaches eventually hit their own brick walls, didn't they?
Absolutely. The promise of scaling up ELIZA or similar systems to achieve genuine common sense or natural language understanding proved incredibly difficult. Manually encoding all the 100 million rules about daily life, that number was actually floated, or accounting for all the subtleties of the English language with its slang, sarcasm, figures of speech, and grammar exceptions, well, it became an insurmountable task.
100 million rules, wow.
Yeah, the sheer volume, the interconnectedness, and the context dependency of human knowledge and linguistic nuance simply overwhelmed these brittle, rule-based systems. This struggle to scale, coupled with recurring roadblocks and unmet expectations, often led to what became known as AI winters, periods where funding and interest in AI research would wane significantly as the initial hype failed to deliver.
Right, a cycle of boom and bust.
Is a cycle of high hopes followed by disillusionment, yeah.
But even as symbolic AI was experiencing its early triumphs and later its challenges, there were some minds already thinking along very different lines, away from the rigid, explicit rules. What if intelligence, like that of our own brains, arose from something far more distributed and, well, organic?
Precisely. And long before the PDP revolution, way back in 1943, Warren McCulloch and Walter Pitts laid crucial groundwork for what we now understand as neural networks. They published a paper titled A Logical Calculus of Ideas Immanent in Nervous Activity. Essentially, they proposed a mathematical model of an artificial neuron, a simple, interconnected unit that could take inputs, process them, and produce an output based on a threshold. They demonstrated that networks of these simplified neurons could, in theory, perform any logical operation.
Okay, so the basic idea was there quite early.
It was a foundational, albeit often overlooked, early step towards understanding computation not as a centralized symbolic process, but as an emergent property of many simple, interconnected units working in parallel. It hinted at a distributed, rather than purely centralized, form of intelligence.
And these early theoretical ideas about interconnected units didn't stay confined to philosophy or pure mathematics. They evolved into what were called perceptrons. These were envisioned as the simplest learning machines, and for a brief, shining moment, they seemed to hold immense promise.
They did. Perceptrons, conceptualized by Frank Rosenblatt in the late 1950s, aimed to gain insights into parallel computation, pattern recognition, knowledge representation, and learning. They were designed as parallel operation devices capable of computing partial predicates simultaneously. A perceptron was, at its core, a simple feed-forward neural network designed for binary classification, capable of learning to distinguish between two categories based on a linear decision boundary. It was a groundbreaking idea.
Because it could learn.
Exactly, because it offered a mathematical model of a single neuron's learning capacity. However, their limitations became a central point of contention in the late 1960s. Minsky and Papert's influential book, Perceptrons, 1969, wasn't just a critique, it was a devastating intellectual blow. They highlighted what they termed fundamental limitations on the kinds of patterns that perceptrons can ever learn to recognize.
Right, the XOR problem comes to mind.
Most famously, yes, they showed that a single-layer perceptron couldn't solve the XOR problem. That is, it couldn't learn to distinguish between patterns that weren't linearly separable. The authors themselves noted that progress had already come to a virtual halt because of the lack of adequate basic theories.
So Minsky and Papert's critique was incredibly influential, effectively casting a very long and chilling shadow over network-based approaches. It led many researchers to believe that connectionist models were fundamentally flawed for any genuinely complex cognitive tasks. This was a pivotal moment.
Yeah.
Because it sent the mainstream of AI research down a completely different path, away from networks and towards what seemed like a more promising avenue, the logical, rule-based elegance of symbolic AI.
Exactly. With the perceived failures of perceptrons, the symbolic approach truly entered its golden age. It seemed to offer a clear, principled path to intelligence. The impression given by systems like ELIZA, however superficial, inadvertently bolstered Minsky's campaign to elevate symbolism over connectionism. For decades, through the 90s, expert systems became the hottest area of AI research and commercialization. Companies poured money into building these systems for medical diagnosis, financial analysis, manufacturing control.
They're actually being used in the real world.
Oh, yes. These systems genuinely attempted to develop common sense systems by programming them with 100 million rules about daily life. For example, an expert system might be programmed with rules like, if patient has fever and cough and fatigue, then consider influenza. Clear, manually defined rules applied automatically.
It offered a seemingly robust and, importantly, explainable form of intelligence.
Explainable was key, yes. But despite their commercial success and initial promise, symbolic AI systems ultimately faced their own set of profound challenges, didn't they? It proved to be far more complex and elusive than anyone initially anticipated.
Yeah, those AI winters you mentioned.
Yes, the hurdles were immense. As we touched on earlier, manually encoding all the rules needed for genuine common sense or accounting for all the subtleties of the English language with its slang, sarcasm, figures of speech, and grammar exceptions proved incredibly difficult, if not impossible. Real-world knowledge is messy, context-dependent, constantly evolving. Symbolic systems struggled with what became known as the frame problem, how to decide which information is relevant and which isn't in a rapidly changing world.
They are brittle.
Very brittle. If you encountered a situation not explicitly covered by a rule, the system would simply fail. This struggle to scale, combined with recurring roadblocks, led to those recurring AI winters. These were periods of existential crisis for symbolic AI, where funding dried up and interest waned because the grand promises weren't being met.
Which created the perfect historical vacuum, you could say.
Exactly. A space for a radically new approach to reemerge and challenge the established order with a fresh perspective.
Okay, so it was against this dynamic backdrop, alternating cycles of high hope and deep disappointment in both symbolic AI and early connectionism, that Rumelhart and McClelland's work truly emerged. Their timing was impeccable, and their vision was, well, truly transformative. They looked beyond the perceived limitations and charted an entirely different path forward.
Their parallel distributed processing, PDP volumes, published in the mid-1980s, were nothing short of a watershed moment, a genuine revolution in cognitive science and artificial intelligence. They proposed that thought was not primarily about manipulating abstract, explicitly defined symbols with rigid, pre-programmed rules, as symbolic AI had asserted. Instead, they argued that intelligence and cognition arose from dynamic patterns of activation across networks of simple processing units.
Patterns of activation. That's the core idea.
That's the core. This wasn't just a minor tweak to existing ideas. It was a fundamental reconceptualization of how intelligence, memory, and learning could arise. PDP effectively revived neural networks, often under the new, broader umbrella term connectionism, becoming a major subject of discussion, and sparking a connectionist revolution in how psychologists, linguists, and computer scientists thought about learning, representation, and the very architecture of the mind.
A complete re-evaluation.
Yes, of the basic building blocks of cognition, directly addressing the brittleness and scaling problems of symbolic AI.
So this idea of patterns of activation is so central to PDP. It means we're definitely not talking about, say, one single neuron or one specific location in the network storing one discrete idea, or a single memory, like a file in a computer folder, right?
No, absolutely not.
That's a radical departure from the symbolic view.
Exactly, and that's the profound insight. In PDP, knowledge isn't stored in discrete, localized symbols or individual addresses like in a traditional computer's memory. Instead, it's inherently distributed across many interconnected units throughout the entire network. A concept, a memory, an understanding of a word, these don't reside in a single on or off unit, or even a small cluster. They emerge from the complex, dynamic pattern of activation across this entire, often vast and intricate network.
Okay, so it's the whole pattern.
It's the whole pattern.
Yeah.
This contrasts sharply with symbolic systems where a symbol might directly and uniquely represent an object or idea, like the word cat being a specific symbol for the animal. Here, the cat concept arises from a particular pattern of neural activity, not a single cat neuron. Think of it like this. Your memory of your grandmother isn't in one specific brain cell. It's in the complex, distributed pattern of activity across countless neurons that fires when you think of her face, her voice, or the smell of her baking.
That distributed nature sounds incredibly robust, especially when you consider real brains, which aren't immune to damage. Was that a key advantage they highlighted?
It absolutely was. This distributed nature means that if one part of the network is damaged, if a few units or connections are lost, the entire system doesn't necessarily collapse. Instead, performance might degrade gracefully, reflecting a more robust and resilient system, much like how human brains can sometimes compensate for damage or loss of neurons.
Graceful degradation, right?
That concept of graceful degradation was a powerful argument for PDP's biological plausibility and its superiority over brittle symbolic systems. It allows for a flexibility and resilience that localized symbolic representations often fundamentally lack.
So if knowledge is this distributed pattern of activation, How do we bridge the gap from those tiny individual activations, these knowledge atoms, to really complex, recognizable thoughts, like understanding an entire narrative or recognizing a familiar face in a crowd? How do the microscopic interactions give rise to the macroscopic phenomena of cognition?
Right, that's the key question. PDP models are designed to operate on two distinct levels of description, elegantly linking the micro to the macro. At the micro level, you have what we might call knowledge atoms. These are the fundamental, undifferentiated units of processing, the individual neurons or simple processing nodes, and their specific connection strengths. These are the basic building blocks. At the macro level, these myriad microinteractions through their collective activity give rise to schemata.
Schemata, like schemas.
Exactly, like schemas. Schemata are larger, more complex cognitive structures emergent, higher order patterns of activation that represent complex concepts, categories, mental models, or even entire narratives. You can think of it like individual musical notes or simple chords, the micro-level interactions, combining and harmonizing to form a full, rich symphony or a complex melody, the macro-level scheme.
Oh, okay. I like that analogy.
The individual notes themselves have little meaning in isolation, but their collective, structured activation creates the profound experience of music, or, in this case, a coherent thought, memory, or understanding.
That musical analogy works well. And what guides this complex process of forming coherent, complex patterns from all those simple interactions? Is there some principle of organization within the network itself?
There is, and it's a critical component. The theory emphasizes coherency or consistency, which is often formalized under the name of harmony. This harmony theory suggests that the network naturally settles into stable patterns of activation that represent the most coherent or consistent interpretation of the input. It aims for a state of maximum internal consistency, much like a physical system settling into a state of minimal energy.
Okay, so it's seeking stability or harmony.
Precisely. This isn't just a metaphor. It's formalized through concepts like an energy function that the network seeks to minimize. Imagine a group of diverse people trying to agree on a complex issue. Each person brings individual thoughts, biases, and arguments, those knowledge atoms. Through interaction, discussion, and adjustment of their views, they might eventually converge towards a shared understanding or consensus.
Right.
This consensus represents a state of higher harmony because their individual views have, through interaction, found a stable, consistent configuration. The network, similarly, seeks out the most agreeable pattern of activity to represent its input.
This ability for a network to represent incredibly complex knowledge is genuinely powerful, but it leads to the core question. How do these networks actually learn? It's not like someone is manually programming in rules or painstakingly defining every single connection strength, right? That would just bring us back to the insurmountable problems of symbolic AI.
You've hit on the truly transformative core of PDP. These models learn. They aren't explicitly programmed with rules like symbolic systems are. A key innovation that made this possible was the effective introduction and utilization of hidden units.
Hidden units, okay.
These are units that are neither direct inputs to the network nor direct outputs from it. Instead, they form intermediate layers, mediating the internal processing and allowing the network to build abstract internal representations of the data.
So these hidden units are essentially the network's way of developing its own internal understanding, its own concepts or features, without us having to explicitly define them beforehand.
Precisely. And that's why they were so revolutionary. They allowed the system to discover underlying features and relationships in the data that we, as programmers, might not even have known to look for. The generalized delta rule and the Hebbian learning rule are fundamental to this process of learning.
Hebbian learning. Neurons that fire together, wire together.
That's the famous summary, yes. Hebbian learning postulates a very simple, biologically inspired mechanism for strengthening connections. If two neurons or units fire together repeatedly, the connection strength between them increases. This strengthens associations within the network based on co-occurrence. Now, while Hebbian learning is crucial, the generalized delta rule was a monumental leap forward, especially for networks with those crucial hidden layers.
Okay, the delta rule, what did that add?
This rule, essentially an early form of what we now call backpropagation, allowed these multi-layered networks to learn by propagating error signals backward through the network. Imagine the network making a prediction or classification, then comparing it to the correct answer. The difference between the prediction and the reality is then systematically used to adjust the strengths of the internal connections layer by layer, starting from the output and working backward towards the input.
So it learns from its mistakes, essentially.
Exactly. This iterative process allows the system to develop a set of connections to and among the hidden units, which, in principle, allows the system to retrieve the correct input pattern from any unique subportion of the input pattern. This ability to form and utilize these sophisticated internal representations is what allowed PDP models to go beyond simple input-output mappings and handle more abstract, complex tasks, fundamentally different from what perceptrons could achieve. It's how they build up an internal dynamic model of the world.
That's a huge step.
Yeah.
Going from a simple association to actually using errors to refine internal representations. Can you give us a concrete example of how these hidden units might learn something complex from seemingly simple inputs?
Certainly. One classic illustrative example involved hidden units learning to count the number of inputs. Okay, imagine a network where the input layer consists of, say, 10 units, any number of which could be active. Through training with various patterns of active inputs, the hidden units wouldn't just respond to individual input units. Instead, one hidden unit might learn to activate strongly if one or more input units were on, another for 2 or more, a third for 3 or more, and so on.
Ah, so it's learning an abstract property like how many?
Exactly. This demonstrates how simple units, through their interactions and learned connection strengths refined by rules like the generalized delta rule, can collectively learn to detect and represent complex, abstract features or properties of the input in this case, a numerical count, without explicit programming for counting. This is the essence of emergent intelligence in these systems, where complexity arises from simple local interactions.
So not only are the connections between units adapting and changing through learning, but also how activation itself flows through the network when it's processing information must be highly dynamic and responsive, right? It's not a static process.
Yes, absolutely. Networks and PDP models utilize dynamic weights and dynamic activation. This means an input unit doesn't just send a fixed immutable signal. Instead, each unit has a fixed amount of activation, e.g. a total activation value of 1, to be distributed among the output units consistent with that input feature.
Okay, so it shares its activation.
It shares it, but not uniformly. It's spread in proportion to the strength of the output feature to which it is connected. Crucially, this distribution also involves competition and inhibition. When one unit activates strongly, it might inhibit the activation of competing units, forcing the network to settle on a more consistent interpretation.
So the network's interpretation of an input isn't rigid. It's constantly being shaped and refined by the current context and the learned strengths of connections, almost like an ongoing internal negotiation.
Precisely. This dynamic allocation and interaction allow for incredibly flexible processing. The interpretation of an input isn't rigid, it's constantly influenced by the current context, the activity of other units, and the learned strengths of the connections between units. It means the network is continuously adapting and refining its internal interpretation of information in real time. It's not a one-way street of information processing. There's a continuous, dynamic interaction, a cascade of activation and inhibition that shapes the flow and meaning of the data within the network until a stable, coherent pattern or harmonious state is achieved.
And that ability to integrate context and make sense of ambiguous input is something symbolic systems found notoriously difficult.
Exactly. It was a major advantage.
Okay, let's talk about some case studies. Language is notoriously one of the most complex cognitive abilities we possess, full of ambiguities, subtle nuances, and heavy context dependencies. Symbolic AI famously struggled with its 100 million rules for language. How did PDP models begin to tackle something so intricate without relying on explicit grammatical rules?
Well, this is where PDP truly shone, offering a compelling alternative to symbolic approaches. It demonstrated how activation competition mechanisms could account for sophisticated language processing in a way that felt far more natural, flexible, and robust than any rule-based system. Researchers like Levin, with his Proteus model, and Glushko showed how conspiracies of partial activations could account for certain aspects of apparently rule-guided behavior.
Conspiracies of partial activations.
Yeah.
I like that phrase.
It captures the idea well. This was a radical idea. It hinted that the rules of language, rather than being explicitly encoded by a programmer or genetically pre-programmed, might actually emerge from the dynamic interactions within the network as it learned from examples.
That's a massive conceptual shift from hard-coded rules to emergent behavior. It challenges a fundamental assumption about how language works. Can you give us a prime example of this emergent behavior in action within language processing?
Absolutely. The trace model of speech perception, developed by James McClelland and Jeffrey Ellman, is a key example. It modeled how we recognize spoken words by processing incoming sounds at multiple interacting levels features, like a burst of sound or a continuous tone, phonemes, the basic units of sound, like a B or P, and words all simultaneously.
At the same time.
Yes, in parallel. What's truly fascinating is how these levels interact in a dynamic feedback loop. For instance, the perception of a phone like T could be dramatically different depending on whether it was preceded or followed by the vowel I or A. The trace model demonstrated that when the unit for I was active, it changed the pattern of connections for units for T in preceding and following segments, illustrating how the broader context of surrounding sounds profoundly shapes the perception of individual phones.
So it's not just bottom-up decoding.
No, it's not just a linear decoding, it's an interactive construction.
So it's far from a simple linear process of sound to word. It's much more interactive, with higher-level knowledge influencing lower-level perception. That really resonates with how we experience language.
Exactly. Trace ingeniously combined top-down and bottom-up information to produce an remarkably effective online speech recognition mechanism. This means that your existing knowledge of words, grammar, and semantic context, the top-down information, influences how you interpret the incoming acoustic sounds, the bottom-up information, and crucially, vice versa.
So they influence each other continuously.
Right. This creates a dynamic, interactive process that effectively resolves ambiguity in real time. For example, if you hear a sound ambiguous between P and B in the context of at, your brain's top-down knowledge that bat and pat are words, but at is not, helps it disambiguate the sound. The cohort model, which proposed that multiple word candidates are activated in parallel as speech comes in, was a key inspiration for Trace in demonstrating how these diverse information streams could be effectively combined to achieve robust recognition.
This is a fantastic example for our listeners to connect with. Think about trying to understand someone speaking in a very noisy room, like a bustling coffee shop or a busy party. Your brain isn't just passively listening to individual sounds and meticulously piecing them together. Instead, you're unconsciously using the context of the conversation. Your vast knowledge of common words and phrases, your expectations about what might be said, and even visual cues to fill in the gaps and make sense of what's being communicated.
That's a perfect analogy.
Trace modeled this dynamic, emergent understanding computationally, showing how networks could achieve similar feats by allowing higher-level word knowledge to feed back and influence the perception of individual phones, a process that symbolic systems found incredibly difficult to account for.
Precisely.
Okay, beyond language, memory is another fundamental cognitive ability that we rely on constantly, often without even realizing it. How does PDP explain our remarkable ability to not only remember specific things, but also to generalize from what we've learned, applying past experiences to entirely new situations?
Well, PDP provides a compelling and elegant framework for distributed models of memory, a stark contrast to how traditional computers store information. Unlike a computer where a piece of information is stored at a specific localized address in PDP, a memory is, once again, a specific pattern of activation distributed across the entire network.
The distributed pattern again.
Exactly. This distributed storage gives it unique and incredibly powerful properties, especially for recall and generalization.
So if I only have a partial cue, like seeing just a part of an image or hearing a snippet of a song, the network can still recall the entire, complete memory. That's what we do as humans all the time.
That's precisely right. The concept of an autoassociator with hidden units is central here. Such a network is trained to reproduce its input at its output. If you then provide it with a partial, noisy, or degraded input, it has the remarkable ability to retrieve the correct input pattern from any unique subportion of the input pattern. Essentially, it can reconstruct the full, complete, and correct memory.
Pattern completion.
Pattern completion, exactly. This isn't just root recall. It's a powerful form of generalization because the network has learned the underlying structure of the complete pattern and can infer or complete missing parts based on that learned structure. It effectively remembers the whole by recognizing a part.
That's a very relatable experience for all of us. Imagine trying to recall an old friend's face. You might catch just a small detail, maybe their distinctive hairstyle, a particular way they smile, or even the sound of their laugh, and suddenly the entire image, along with a flood of associated memories, rushes into your mind. An autoassociator behaves in a remarkably similar way, pulling a complete, coherent pattern from an incomplete or noisy cue.
Yes, and this is also precisely how these systems achieve generalization. They learn underlying patterns and relationships from specific examples, abstracting away the specifics, and can then apply the learned understanding to novel but related inputs. It shows how they can go beyond mere rote memorization to truly understand and apply concepts.
What's particularly compelling about PDP, at least for me, is its ambitious goal of connecting these artificial models with biological reality, trying to reflect how our own brains might actually work. It attempts to bridge that incredibly complex gap between the abstract mind and the physical brain.
This focus on biological realism was a significant driving force behind much of the PDP research. It led to the development of biologically plausible models of various cognitive functions, such as Zipser's work on place recognition and goal location. These models weren't just about achieving a task, they were constrained by both the requirements of accomplishing the tasks and by a desire to achieve some degree of biological plausibility.
So it wasn't just about making something smart, it was about making it smart like a brain.
That was the deeper goal, yes. To gain genuine insight into how computation is organized in the brain itself, making explicit connections between the abstract network models and actual neural structures and processes.
That sounds like a fundamental quest to really understand the neural basis of thought, rather than just building intelligent systems.
Yeah.
What specifically did they look at in terms of biological mechanisms?
It absolutely is. This line of research delves deeply into the neural interpretation of PDP models of cognition, aiming to forge a mathematical relationship between the principles of mind and brain. It actively considers the dynamic nature of real neural systems, recognizing that brains are not static machines. For instance, the idea of neural plasticity is highly relevant here.
Ah, plasticity, the brain changing itself.
Exactly. Our sources mention the uncovering of previously silent synapses and changes in synaptic strengths at the cortical and subcortical levels as biological explanations for observed neural reorganization. This suggests that connections in the brain are not fixed. Synapses can be transformed from a silent state to an active state, profoundly influencing how sensory information is represented and processed and how memories are formed and retrieved.
So connections can be turned on or off, essentially.
Or strengthened and weakened. This biological dynamism, the constant strengthening, weakening, and rerouting of connections, perfectly aligns with the adaptive learning nature of PDP networks with their dynamic weights and activation. It's a remarkable parallel between abstract computation and biological reality.
Hearing that, the parallel to neuroplasticity suddenly clicks for me. It genuinely feels like a breakthrough insight. It implies that the ability of our brains to adapt, to heal after injury, or to learn entirely new skills isn't just about growing new cells or structures.
Yeah, it's not just about neurogenesis.
It's significantly about strengthening and rerouting existing connections, activating dormant pathways, even pruning unused ones, much like the adaptive weights and activations in a PDP model. That connection to biology was truly groundbreaking. Could you elaborate on just how revolutionary that parallel was for neuroscientists and what new avenues of research it opened up?
It was indeed a profound shift for neuroscientists. Before PDP, many models of brain function were still quite static or focused on highly localized functions. PDP offered a robust computational framework for how distributed processing and learning could occur in a biologically plausible way. It provided a language, you could say, to describe how the brain's massive parallelism, its adaptive synaptic connections, and its capacity for self-organization could give rise to complex cognition.
So you have new tools to think with.
Exactly. This opened up avenues for investigating not just what parts of the brain do what, but how those parts interact dynamically and learn through experience, leading to richer models of everything from sensory processing to motor control. It moved beyond simple stimulus-response models to more intricate network-based explanations of cognitive processes, directly informing our understanding of brain development, learning disorders, and even recovery from brain injury. It truly bridged the conceptual gap between computation and biological function in a way that previous approaches had not.
Okay, so we've journeys from the rigid, explicit, rule-based logic of symbolic AI, which often found itself stuck in the weeds of manual programming and brittleness, to the fluid, emergent intelligence of parallel distributed processing. Rumelhart and McClelland, along with their visionary colleagues, truly opened up entirely new ways of understanding how complex intelligence could arise from simple, interconnected units learning through dynamic interaction.
Indeed. PDP didn't just revive perceptron-like networks under the new name connectionism. It fundamentally changed the conceptual basis of how we think about parallel computation, pattern recognition, knowledge representation, and learning. It offered a powerful adaptive alternative, demonstrating that the power of the brain stems not from any single fixed universal principle, but from a variety of ways to develop new mechanisms and to adapt older ones to perform new functions.
A more flexible, adaptable view of intelligence?
Much more so. This foundational work in distributed processing, learning through example via mechanisms like the generalized delta rule, and the emergence of self-organizing internal representations laid crucial groundwork for much of what we see in AI today, including the deep learning revolution that has so profoundly impacted our world.
Absolutely. This profound shift in thinking, from viewing cognition as the manipulation of explicit, predefined rules to seeing it as emergent patterns of activation across networks, has had widespread and far-reaching echoes. Its impact extends far beyond academic computer science circles. It deeply influenced psychology's understanding of human learning and memory, revolutionized neuroscience's models of brain function and plasticity, and even profoundly shaped the philosophy of mind's ongoing debates about consciousness, representation, and what it truly means to think.
Right. The connectionist revolution demonstrated a powerful truth that complex behaviors and understandings could arise from simple local interactions without a central controller explicitly encoding all knowledge. The inherent challenges faced by symbolic AI, like the immense difficulty of manually encoding all the rules for understanding natural language, found a potent counterargument in the adaptive, context-sensitive learning mechanisms of PDP. It taught us to look for the microstructure of cognition, those foundational distributed interactions, to explain the macro phenomena of thought and intelligence that we observe, fundamentally altering the trajectory of AI and cognitive science.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, consider this. If our most complex thoughts and deepest memories are fundamentally just patterns of activation across vast, interconnected networks, constantly adapting through dynamic connections and subtle shifts in synaptic strengths, then what does that truly imply about the nature of our own subjective experience? Are our moments of sudden insight, our aha moments, simply the network settling into a new, more harmonious configuration of connections and activations?
That's a fascinating thought. And if we can increasingly model, observe, and perhaps even influence these patterns at both micro and macro levels, how might that reshape not just how we build intelligent systems, but how we understand and even enhance our own cognitive processes, our very ability to learn, remember, and adapt throughout our lives? It's a profound question, hinting at a future where the lines between mind, brain, and machine might become even more intertwined and intriguing, pushing the boundaries of what we thought possible for intelligence itself.